Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 30th video here in this 84-part series. This video I'm going to talk about very briefly as to who I am, my history, my childhood, and how I came about being the way that I am. This video is going to be split into two videos. This is part one, and part one talks about my childhood and my teenage years and everything before the beginning of my spiritual journey. And then part two will be talking about everything after my spiritual beginning. So in this body, I was born in Ukraine, in a little village called Drohovich in western Ukraine. And I lived in Ukraine until I was 9 years old. Ukraine being a second or third world country, you can pretty much do whatever you want. And as a child, I was a big hooligan. I got into a lot of shenanigans. I did things that here in the West you cannot do as a child. Very irresponsible things. As a kid, my grandfather taught me how to swim at a very early age, and I loved swimming. That was my favorite activity. I would go to the lake and I would jump off the rocks into the water, and I couldn't wait until summertime came so that I can go swimming. Unfortunately, my father had divorced my mother at around 3 years old, when I was 3 years old, and my father was not in my life in a meaningful way. He would drop by here and there, he would say happy birthday, or he would give me some money for snacks, but I would not see him for months at a time. So typically I lived with my grandfather. I should step back. At about 4 years old, maybe 5 years old, something around then, my mom and her mom, my grandmother, had moved to Canada. They got visas and they came here for a better life. They came to Canada for a better life. So I was left with my grandmother and my grandfather. My grandmother on my father's side and my grandfather on my mother's side. I preferred to live with my grandfather because he was a man, and it was much easier for me to live with him. I was much happier with him. He was a gym teacher in Ukraine. And one thing I remember is catching fish, or we would buy fish, raw fish, and we would salt the fish, and we would leave the fish to dry in the garage. And after about a week, the fish would turn to this very crispy, almost like a chip type of meat, and it was so delicious. And I'm looking forward to making that again here in Australia. So that's how I lived for the first 9 years until my mom and her new boyfriend came to Canada. And my mom was pregnant with a new baby, and they came to Ukraine to take me to Canada. And my mom gambled because she didn't really have the visa for me to go to Canada. So she also didn't have a permanent residence to stay in Canada. So she kind of gambled coming back to Ukraine because there could have been a chance that she would be denied entry to Canada again. And not only would she not be able to bring me to Canada, but she would not also be able to go to Canada herself. Luckily, that didn't happen, and it worked out, and I managed to fly to Canada. So it was a 9-hour plane ride. It was very uncomfortable. But I remember I didn't want to go. I didn't want to leave Ukraine. I was very comfortable in Ukraine. It was my home. I was free, truly free. And when I came to Canada, I felt like I had just been put into jail because everything is so organized. You cannot go outside of the bounds of the law in any way. And so I felt like I was living in prison until, my late teenage years or even early adulthood. But, that was a drawback. There was lots of plus sides, like the snacks were much better, and I got to play video games, and I met a friend, also a Ukrainian boy that I was friends with for a very long time. And in Canada, we moved a lot. We moved around a lot. We moved houses. We moved buildings. And then came when I came to Canada, I didn't know how to speak English. And I remember I watched Family Guy and The Simpsons a lot, and also Futurama. And I learned how to speak English through watching those shows. I didn't pay attention in school. I hated school. School was one of the most miserable things in my whole life. And what's funny is that in Ukraine, when people ask me, what are you gonna do when you grow up? Like, what are you gonna do with schools? And I said in a not so polite way, I'm going to, essentially, I'm gonna make all the schools go away so that children can be free from homework. You can use your imagination how I can make schools go away in a very fast and entertaining way. So yeah, I didn't like school, and I didn't like school in Canada. I thought it was a huge waste of time, and I just managed to pass my courses just so that my parents wouldn't yell at me that I failed. But my parents did tell me quite frequently that, that the options for someone that doesn't do well in school are very limited. But I always knew that was wrong. Even if I failed every single class, I knew that my future would be secured. That this irrelevant information that I'm learning in school that has no significant bearing on my future, or where I'm going to be headed. And then high school came, which was very traumatic for me, because high school is like you're entering a new world. You're entering in a kind of like an animal facility where there's bigger beasts than you, and it's much more severe than elementary school. And somehow I got through that. I was just always quiet and minded my own business. I wasn't invited to any parties, or I didn't really have many friends, but I was okay with that. And again, didn't pay much attention in school and failed almost every single class. I'm sorry, I didn't fail. I barely passed every single class. After high school had ended, I started to dive into the spiritual sciences. I started to learn about the third eye, and my sense of awareness was awakening. And that is what I'm going to talk about in the next video. How I found Vipassana meditation, how I found the Buddha's teachings, and everything as it relates to that.